Hey, what's up everyone? My name is Nicholas Corcel and you're watching The Literary Nomad. Today we're going to be taking a quick break from the Mao-Tu read-along that we've been doing over the last month or so on the channel and talk about 2666 by Chilean author Roberto Bolaño. And now this book is one of the biggest books that I've ever read. It sits at a little bit over 1,000 pages total. And so that is far too big to just do one review and call it good. And so the natural way of breaking this up is to do one video about each book that makes up this greater book. Originally, this book was going to be 5 or possibly even 6 books, but he died before the 6th book was ever really able to be conceived in a meaningful way. So in some ways, this entire novel is unfinished, though it's still probably one of the most meaningful and most significant books ever written. Regardless, it's got 5 parts. We have the part about the critics, the part about Amalfitano, the part about fate, the part about the crimes, and the part about Arcimboldi. And so we're going to be tackling it in 5 separate videos. So in today's video, naturally, we are going to be focusing on book 1, the part about the critics. And many people have said that this is, quote unquote, the most boring part of the book. And I haven't read the other 4 parts, so I can't really say how it is relative to the other ones. But I'd have to push back, because while there's not a whole lot of action that takes place in the part about the critics, a lot does happen, and it's a very insightful book, and it tells me a lot about the type of writer Bolaño is and the themes that we're going to be tackling in this book. Because, as a quick aside, I've never read anything by Bolaño before, and I know in previous videos I've said I like to kind of introduce myself to an author with some of their lesser works, and this is easily his most famous work, and so I haven't done that this time. But I saw on Twitter Sterling Holy White Mountain, a short story writer that I really admire. He's currently writing and teaching at Stanford. I've talked about one of his short stories on the channel already before. But regardless, he kept talking on Twitter about how life-changing this novel was and how it really has moved him and changed him as a writer. And I don't know, I couldn't keep resisting it. And then I bought the copy. It got rained on. The UPS driver left it outside, so it's kind of fraying. It's beaten up and tattered already. And I don't know, there's just something though about the physical book decaying as I read it, as I'm reading about like this decaying contemporary society that, I don't know, I think it does add something kind of interesting to it. And so in this initial book, we're introduced to 4 characters, and these 4 main characters kind of make up the brunt of this first book. And so we have Jean-Claude Peltier, who is a university professor in Paris, and he's a French man. We have Piero Morini, who is an Italian professor. He teaches in Turin. We have Manuel Espinosa, who teaches in Madrid and actually is Spanish. And then finally, we have Liz Norton, who teaches in London and is English. And so the first 3 people that I talked about, the 3 men, they all are full professors or department chairs. They're very, very prestigious. They're very well respected in their field. And their field is German literature. Liz, on the other hand, is still a professor at a university. So obviously, in comparison to the general population of the world, she has a lot of, like cultural capital and prestige. But in her friend group, she definitely is at the bottom of like the academic or professional totem pole. I think that is very, very clear. Regardless, though, she gets a lot of unspoken capital being the woman in the group, and she ends up sleeping with 2 of the 3 men very quickly. But regardless, we'll get to that later. The key unifying factor of these 4 people is their love for this fictitious German writer named Arcimboldi. Arcimboldi is that classic reclusive writer, like a Pynchon, a Salinger, the type that we deal with a lot, the type that we dealt with also in Mao-Tu with Bill Gray. Very similar. It's a very classic trope and stereotype for writers that is used all over the place in fiction, and we see in the real world as well. So Arcimboldi is this type of guy. He's very, very well respected. He's been like kind of nominated for Nobels a couple times. He's never won one, but he's that guy. He's that guy who's in the discussion for top 3 or 4 best writers alive, the best writer in Europe. These are the labels that are commonly ascribed to him. And these 4 people are all absolutely obsessed with Arcimboldi. And nobody knows who he is, and so they're just like, they mine through all of these sources, and they are just constantly trying to get every piece of information they can about Arcimboldi. And they live these very, very classic, but also stereotypical lives of European elites. They live a life of culture, of luxury, of fine dining, of art, of novels, of papers and conferences. This is their life. It couldn't be further removed from the life of somebody who lives in a very, very dangerous, dirty, very uncomfortable, hot, sweltering city in Latin America. And while that contrast doesn't seem like it makes any sense, that is what this whole novel is grappling with. Because the key thesis, or the key point of this novel, is focused around a very real place. Of course, it's fictionalized in the novel, but that real place is called Ciudad Juárez in northern Mexico, right on the US-Mexico border in the north. And Ciudad Juárez is a very, very famous city, but it is famous in possibly the worst way that a city could ever be famous for. Many years ago, Ciudad Juárez got national news, or even global news rather, for its incredible amount of femicides. And that was a term that really wasn't used very commonly in the world. And a femicide, as the name suggests, is just the homicide of a woman for no reason other than the fact that she is a woman. It's targeted, deliberate violence against women and their bodies for no real reason whatsoever. And Ciudad Juárez has more of that going on right now than any other city in the world. And it's not even close. And so in this novel, Bolaño creates this place called Santa Teresa, or Saint Teresa, depending on how you want to read it. And in the novel, Roberto Bolaño has fictionalized this very real Ciudad Juárez and these ongoing femicides through Santa Teresa, a city, again, locationally, which is identical to Ciudad Juárez. He just changed the name for the book. So as Jean-Claude, Piero, Manuel, and Liz are going through their lives, and as I briefly said earlier, Liz ends up hooking up with Jean-Claude and Manuel, and they know about each other. And they're all hooking up, traveling to these European capitals, going to these conferences, going to these these very, very fine dining restaurants for meals and this type of life. We see this veneer that the West, or maybe not even the West, you could even extend it further, these very comfortable, wealthy, affluent societies that maybe don't value intellectualism, but have the luxury to have a lot of people, a significant demographic, that, of course, not the majority, but still a very large group of people that can live these intellectual lives and pursue intellectualism for no reason other than for their own enjoyment and pleasure. And so they go through this, and they end up talking to this guy who believes that he knows where Archimboldi is. And so they get talking, and this guy knows this other guy who is in Mexico City, an intellectual, a writer. He goes by El Cerdo. And El Cerdo lives, like I said, in Mexico City, and he's a member of like this Mexican intellectual elite. And El Cerdo, and I believe, in my opinion, I read it as a bit of humor from Bolaño, calling a Mexican intellectual El Cerdo. And these European elites are kind of poking fun at him, and he's kind of making a commentary, on how Europe views themselves as intellectually superior to the rest of the world. You see this with stereotypes that Americans are dumb, but then that even triples and triples and triples when you talk about how they view Latin Americans. They view them maybe not as subhuman, but certainly as lesser of the mind than they are. And of course, when I say they, I'm speaking in stereotypes, but these are cultural values that permeate, and when you visit these places, you can definitely see them. You can see when you walk the streets of Paris that there's an energy of intellectual elitism that is not as prevalent on the streets of Mexico City, Bogota, places like that. Regardless, I digress. They get talking to this guy, and he believes that he knows where Archimboldi is, and so they fly to Mexico City. Jean-Claude, Piero, and Liz Jean-Claude, Manuel, and Liz all fly to Mexico City. Piero stays back because Piero is wheelchair bound, and for whatever reason, he just doesn't want to travel. And so they get to Mexico City, and they talk to El Cerdo, and he talks about this very tall German man. Really, we don't get much more. Archimboldi is just a tall German man. Tall, tall, tall. That's repeatedly how he is described. And he says that he talked to him, and this guy who he believes and he's certain is Archimboldi is in the city of Santa Teresa. And so they go to Santa Teresa. These three very well-regarded European intellectuals go to this city, and a couple people say there's things off in that city. There's mild mentions of violence that we begin to hear as they travel into the city And then they start to travel through the city, but they brush it all off. They're just like, oh, look at these silly Mexicans. They don't know what they're talking about, whatever. They just dismiss everything they say, and they view themselves as above them. And so now we're in Santa Teresa, and they're searching for Arcimboldi, and they can't find him. No matter where they look, no matter what they do, they can't find him. And admittedly, they do a pretty half-assed search of him, or for him, but regardless, they do not find him. And they keep looking, they keep looking, they keep looking. And Liz and Jean-Claude and Manuel, they all end up having sex together at once. And shortly after that, Liz decides she's leaving Mexico and going back to Europe. And so we have this very long and extended section where we're hearing about what they're doing in Santa Teresa. Manuel meets this girl who sells rugs, and they begin a bit of a relationship. And in between all that, we are hearing about Liz's email that she wrote to Jean-Claude and Manuel. And in that email, we learn that Liz has decided to be with Piero Morini, the Italian man who is never really discussed as a love interest, but nonetheless, that's who she chooses. She says that she's in love with him, the one whose relationship with her is purely intellectual. They've never had sex before. They've never really expressed intimacy in that way. They just speak about life, about art, about love, and these topics. And so she leaves Santa Teresa to be with Piero, and we have Jean-Claude Peltier and Manuel Espinosa. They remain in Santa Teresa. And Manuel keeps seeing this girl. Her name is Rebecca. He keeps seeing Rebecca, and they end up going to a nightclub. And at the nightclub, Rebecca starts to tell us a little bit more about what is going on with all of these women in Santa Teresa. And she says a lot of women will get attacked by this killer. She refers to it as the killer, or a killer who preys on young women as they leave the club, and they get kidnapped and they're never seen again. And again, Espinosa just brushes her off. He completely ignores really anything about it, doesn't worry about it too much. It bothers him for a fleeting moment, but he ends up having sex with her in a car shortly after, so clearly it didn't bother him too much. And he continues to go back to the hotel where Jean-Claude waits for him every night. And that just continues for a little while. And eventually Manuel will make a quick comment where, he talks about, oh, I'm going to come back for you one day. But I think deep down we know that that's not true. He's never going to come back for her. It's just another classic story of somebody from a very wealthy country going on vacation, promising the world to a local person, exploiting their financial differential, and then eventually leaving and going back to their lives and forgetting about that person who has exchanged some of the most intimate parts of themselves with under a false promise. Of course, he doesn't say, do this and I'll take you to Madrid, no, but the implications are there. And I think that is also like a really interesting commentary on something that we've seen develop a lot more since this novel's publication. I think it came out in like 2003 in Spanish, like 2009 in English. We've seen with like the whole passport bro movement and things like that, we've seen that that's even more common than ever. I mean, of course, we always had it with things like the mail order brides and whatnot, but that was an interesting commentary that you don't see a lot in novels. And then just briefly wrapping up kind of the plot summary of what happened at the very end of the part about the critics, Peltier proclaims that he knows that Arcimboldi is there. He knows for a fact that Arcimboldi is there, but he also knows for a fact that they will never see him. And so with that, Espinosa and Peltier decide that they are going to return to Europe, but they have this weird feeling that Arcimboldi's work has forever been changed because they know that they're in the city with him. And I don't know, that is an interesting feeling. I felt that before. Honestly, just this past weekend, like I was in Chicago and I knew that Lionel Messi was staying in a hotel like right next to where I was walking, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. Like somebody that I've watched on TV my whole life is, 20 feet away from me, 100 feet away from me. Of course, I can't see him, but I know he's there. And it also kind of made me think about the idea of like quantum mechanics, or how certain particles or certain things don't happen unless you can see them, yet they do happen. Like how these contradictory binaries, I guess we could call them, how if you're not there to observe it, did it really happen? Like Schrodinger's cat, for example. If you have a cat in a box and poison goes off every 50% of the time, poison goes off and kills the cat. until you open the box, the cat is both alive and dead at the same time. Though, of course, we know that's not possible. Cats cannot be both alive and dead at the same time. But perception plays a significant role in how these things play out. And, of course, I don't fully know what I'm talking about there, but you get the idea. And it made me think about that in this novel a lot. Perhaps the most interesting part about this whole section of the book is the way that Bolaño masterfully positions violence on the outskirts of the novel. So there's a lot of violence on the fringes, and you can feel it kind of bubbling up here as our characters are circling around it in the comfort of Western Europe. And every once in a while, as they're coming around here, we will quickly jut in, and then we'll jut right back out. And there's two great examples of this. And one is when Jean-Claude Peltier and Manuel Espinosa almost beat a Pakistani cab driver to death in London. The cab driver says something moderately disrespectful to Liz, and they respond by pulling him out of the cab and just completely beating on him, kicking him, and completely really destroying his body. They have no regard for who he is, and there's nothing really to make us think that it's a targeted attack ethnically, but it is mentioned that he's Pakistani many times, and so it does add a little bit of targeting because of who somebody is, which you can then link to the femicide that is later on, right? The femicide is targeting the women. Theirs is targeting the Pakistani guy. Of course, it's not outright targeting the Pakistani guy in the way that the femicide is outright targeting the women, but it's kind of, we're building up to that. And so we're introducing the theme of targeted violence in a very muted, subdued way at first before we dive fully into it later. And I thought that was completely masterful. The way that he is, and he being Bolaño, is so masterful with the way he dances around and implements violence. It's very, very easy for a novel about Ciudad Juárez to come off as, like gore porn or just super, super aggressive for aggression's sake. Something like Bret Easton Ellis would write. And I don't particularly have a problem with how Bret Easton Ellis writes, but it's not for me most of the time. And I think if this novel was written in his style, I'd be very put off for it, and I don't think I'd finish it. And so I really, really appreciated that. And then number two, we have this guy. His name is Edwin Johns, and he's a painter from London who ends up cutting off the hand that he paints with, and that is what puts him into global superstardom as an artist. And so we're kind of getting this idea about how does society view violence, and what are the societal rewards for violence. This guy just cut his own hand off, of course alluding maybe to Van Gogh with the ear, I'm not sure, but he cuts his hand off, and then society loves him for it. And so why is that violence totally acceptable? Why is it totally okay, and not only is it okay, but it's celebrated, encouraged, and even beloved that this painter cut off his painting hand, but the violence in Santa Teresa is not okay? That is something that's interesting to think about. Of course, in my opinion, they're both terrible, but why is violence perpetuated within the confines of European intellectualism and the pursuit of art? Why is that good, and why is the violence committed by Latin Americans in Santa Teresa bad? I think that's something interesting to think about. And of course, with a lot of these books, and we've talked about this a bit in the Maltu series, which is about terrorism, these books make claims that are probably overstated. They say things that if you read it literally, it's crazy. Like the idea of like in Maltu is the idea that is art and terrorism equal. Of course not, when you think about it just in black and white binaries. Of course it's not. But what these texts do are they offer you a tool to take the black and the white and blend them together and make a gray. And then you can spend 1,000 pages exploring that gray. And then after you read the novel, you can walk around, go to a park, walk through your city, wherever you live or whatever you like to do, and think about those ideas. Okay, obviously terrorists aren't artists. We all know that. But what is the role of terrorism in our society? How has the media affected the role of terrorism in our society? Does this hyper-focusing on violence and negativity, does that downplay the role of art? Is that why we live in a TikTok generation where nobody wants to read a book, but they want to just scroll all day? Those are questions that you should be grappling with when you walk away with it. So I really challenge any of you out there who are reading texts like this or Mao Tzu or whatever. I think this particular way of thinking really does lend itself with postmodern texts, because they give you a lot to chew on and they don't really feed it to you directly. But think about, like, what is the author getting at? What does he want me to be thinking about right now? And really generate your own thoughts about it. And I think that's where you get the most out of it. For example, in 2666, at least in this first book, this first chapter, the part about the critics, think about the relationship between Europe and Latin America. Consider all of the context. Now add a layer of violence on top of that. How is violence perceived in both places? How is violence policed? Why is violence championed in some ways and criticized in others? And how do you feel about all of this? How do you think, or not how do you think, but rather what do you think this says about who we are, and about, honestly, out of fear of sounding incredibly pretentious, what does this all say just about who we are and what it means to be humans? I am incredibly excited to continue diving through the rest of the parts of this book. It's a very long one. Next we have the part about Amalfitano, who is a university professor in Santa Teresa that they meet near the end of the first book. Very excited to read more about that, and very excited to share it with you guys. If you're on the fence about this book and scared because of how thick it is, don't be. It's very easy to read in comparison to something like Infinite Jest. I will be the first to admit I got 200 pages in Infinite Jest, quit. A couple months later, got 100 pages in, quit again. Infinite Jest is a nightmare to read. At one point in my life, I'm sure I'll go back to it. I would love to tackle that book, because I don't like that I started it and couldn't finish it. But if that is a fear that you have, don't have it with this book. It's very straightforward to read, and the ideas are pretty heady. But just, read through it and periodically stop, take a break, digest what you wrote, write down some thoughts, and then go and maybe look up some online resources. That's what I've been doing, and it's helped a lot. If you guys enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. My name is Nicholas Corcel, and I'll see you in the next one.